Hi, I'm John Pasalis, housing analyst and founding broker at Realosophy Realty, where I lead our team of agents in providing data-driven real estate advice to home buyers and home sellers throughout Toronto and the Greater Toronto Area. We launched this Toronto Real Estate Summit because we're getting a lot of questions from consumers about the volatility in our economy and our housing market that was brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're going to be talking to leading economists, housing industry leaders, personal finance experts, and real estate agents to get a better understanding of what's going on in our markets today and what are some of the key things that we should be looking for in the months ahead so you can all make smarter real estate decisions. If you have more specific questions about your home buying and selling needs, please feel free to email me anytime at askjohn@movesmartly.com, and I hope you enjoy this interview. Hi, John Pasalis here from Realosophy Realty. Right now, we're going to be hearing from Josh Gordon. Josh is assistant professor at Simon Fraser University, has a very keen interest in studying housing markets. And one of the reasons I love chatting with Josh is because he has a strong policy background and he approaches some of these questions about housing markets from a completely different perspective than I ever would. And today's discussion is a good example of that. He's trying to understand how weaknesses with our tax code can help explain some of these really elevated house prices we see in cities like Toronto and Vancouver. We're going to be talking about one of his latest papers he's published. So without any delay, let's jump right into my chat with Josh Gordon. So thanks, Josh, for joining us today for our Toronto Real Estate Summit. Very excited to be talking to you about a topic that's, we hear a lot about in the news. It's a lot on people's minds. And of course, it's this idea of, what role, non-resident investors or buyers are having on our housing markets. And it's exciting to be talking to, of course, because you just published a paper recently that really tries to answer these questions. So thanks very much for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
Yeah. So I think the first place to start is, really kind of just getting your thoughts on, kind of one of the tensions I think there is when we're looking at these types of studies that sort of look at foreign purchases of real estate. I recall like several years ago, maybe 3-4 years ago, even the head of CMHC had suggested, this isn't great. We're scapegoating, people who don't look like us and implying that it's not good economics. So, I mean, how do you kind of look at some of these tensions when doing this type of research?
Sure. I mean, there's a range of points to be made there. My view has always been, well, if you have a affordability problem, solving it starts with having a good diagnosis. So it's about having an accurate diagnosis of what's going on in your housing market. And so it's not really a question of scapegoating, it's a question of understanding simply what are the forces at work. And so if the role of foreign money is substantial, then you should be aware of it and you should recognize it, because that's going to influence the kind of policy tools that you might use. The other point there is in terms of scapegoating. I mean, a lot of the things that are called for out of this stuff is to change our Canadian policy framework, right? So it's, in many respects, in fact, we've made foreign ownership a very attractive proposition, and we can talk about kind of the dynamics around that. The satellite family dynamic is a very attractive kind of proposition. And so it's not something to blame people who are doing this. It's more just to recognize that we have set up policy structures that encourage this type of activity and that it has a negative impact on affordability. And so, again, it's just about having a proper diagnosis. The other thing that's really interesting is when you look at the polling on this stuff, like, support for a foreign buyer tax or something like that, first of all, it's very high. Support for foreign buyer taxes have had around 80 to 90% support in BC. I think they're around 80%, 75% in Toronto. But if you actually break it down by kind of ethnic or racial background, there's no strong difference between kind of East Asian, South Asian, and Caucasian. So the idea that kind of this is a concern that's only felt by, you know, people who have kind of racist motives or something like that. I mean, that's just, it's not borne out by the data at all. And so this was a claim that was made in the foreign buyer tax case. And the judge basically just waved it away because there's no good evidence for it. The final thing I'll say here is that there's kind of a long-standing effort on the part of people, you know, involved in the industry for kind of obvious reasons, to make discussions of tempering housing demand and potentially kind of, you know, reducing housing demand, to make those discussions taboo, to make them out of bounds, so that, you know, you can't ever question the demand side in effect. And so I just see this as one kind of part of that. I mean, it was very clearly being used cynically in the Vancouver debate. You know, I don't know the Toronto case quite as well, but I mean, when I was involved in that debate, I mean, it was being used somewhat cynically there too. But I think we've just moved on from that. I think it's kind of widely recognized, and now we have a bunch of data, so we can now show this stuff with kind of a lot of confidence.
So one thing I found really interesting about your paper, I mean, even just how you approach this question, I mean, it wasn't kind of an approach I think most people would think about, which is you kind of approached it from a weakness in our tax system is kind of how you set up your paper. And maybe you can kind of unpack that idea, because I don't think that that's kind of obvious to the average person who would be thinking about sort of this question.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, this goes back to the idea of a faulty policy structure. I mean, one way to think about it is the following: is suppose you have two wealthy buyers that are trying to buy a property in a nice neighborhood. You know, in Toronto, you could say Oakville or wherever, Forest Hill or something like that. In Vancouver, Point Grey or West Vancouver, and one buyer is using domestic cash, and so they have to make a bunch of domestic income, and on that domestic income, they're paying a bunch of income taxes. And those income taxes, as part of the Canadian social contract, go towards paying for things like healthcare, education, you know, investments in infrastructure, all those different things that make Canadian society a wonderful place, and that's part of our deal. And so you could pay, you know, a third to a half of, or, you know, at a marginal rate, but, you know, a third to 40% of your income potentially at the higher brackets in income taxes. But if you have another buyer who's using foreign income or wealth, who's using money that's earned in a low tax jurisdiction, which doesn't have all those various social services and doesn't have to contribute to those social services, they don't have to pay into that. And so essentially every single year, you could buy that house and not be paying in to the Canadian tax system in the same way as the Canadian domestic buyer. And so you have a huge advantage over the Canadian domestic buyer if you're earning your money in a low tax jurisdiction abroad that doesn't have all those various social services and that doesn't enforce its tax laws rigorously. And so you have a huge advantage. And the other thing is you could be a multimillionaire and essentially be paying a quite modest tax contribution, which is your property taxes, right? And getting all the same things as the wealthy person who's making their money in Canada. And so it creates this incentive to place your family here and to make your money abroad, right? And this is the satellite family phenomenon. And again, that means that, you know, your nicest property in many respects is going to get bought up by those folks because the people who are earning domestically simply can't compete.
So the tension there, of course, is this idea that, you know, people living here, earning a good portion of their money not in Canada, paying taxes outside of Canada at much lower tax rates, and effectively, I mean, have virtually no income to show in Canada. Is that kind of the...
Yeah, I mean, and in fact, we have the history of the investor immigration program to kind of to back this up, right? The people who entered into through this program often bought very expensive homes, and you know we have data from the CHSP on that, the Canada Housing Statistics Program on that, And so they were buying very expensive housing, but they were declaring very low incomes. And so the average amount that an IIP, an investor immigrant program kind of typical individual or household was paying in taxes was around 1,400 a year annually in income taxes, right? So this is a very low amount. And that's from a kind of a Government Canada report, right? So we know that essentially you had very wealthy people coming in, buying quite expensive housing and declaring very low domestic incomes, even though there was an intention that they would come set up businesses, but that's not in fact what happened. And so, you know, if you have a sufficient number of those types of situations, then that's going to affect both your income statistics and your housing statistics, because they're going to be using a lot of money, but they're going to be using foreign money that's not necessarily declared to the Canadian authorities. And so again, when we start to parse the data, that's what we see, and we can talk about that in a bit.
Interesting. So one thing your paper did that I thought was super interesting, because I mean it's really similar to kind of a lot of the research that I've been doing, and it's, you know, again, a lot of research on housing typically takes like this bird's eye view and says, okay, what's the price to income of just Toronto, and let's try to understand Toronto and Vancouver. And what you did was something a little bit more interesting, I find, and it's really just trying to kind of parse out the different segments of that market and the different municipalities in that market, and try to understand, you know, the deviations from income across these different regions to kind of get a better sense of what's happening. And maybe you can kind of just walk us through that thinking and some of the things that you found when you did sort of this type of analysis by different municipalities within a metropolitan area.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can take you to some slides on that. So, you know, to just kind of walk people through the logic a little bit here is when we think of a typical housing market, you would think that, you know, people who make more money are going to buy in more expensive areas. And so more expensive areas, you know, areas deemed to have, you know, nicer amenities or whatever, will have higher average incomes, right? And so this is the kind of the median household income of people who own single family detached houses or single detached houses who are working age, right? So we're controlling for, you know, the presence of renters, controlling for the presence of seniors and so on. We're just looking at the incomes of the people who own these single detached houses. And so as we would expect, right? So the average income in the areas that are less pricey are much lower, and the areas that are kind of deemed nicer, more expensive, right, have much higher incomes, right? So that's the typical pattern that we would see and we would expect to see.
So just to walk through this, at the bottom we have household income. So we have household income going from 80,000 to 160.
Yeah.
And then, you know, on this axis we have house prices. So what you're saying is, you know, people with lower incomes are affording lower priced homes, obviously, and then the higher the income, the higher the home price, which is kind of the relationship we would expect.
Exactly. That's the typical relationship that you would expect, right? If people are using domestic declared income to purchase housing. What's interesting, and I'm just going to give you the stark example of Vancouver briefly before moving to Toronto, is that if we look at that same relationship in Vancouver, it's virtually non-existent. Right? So it's pretty remarkable. Like so this is, you know, again, we're looking at the household income of the people who own single family detached houses who are working age, right? So these are not pensioners, etc. And, you know, the incomes don't align well with the house prices, right? So some of the places with the highest house prices, Richmond, Burnaby, City of Vancouver, have actually relatively low average household incomes, which is...
If we look at just West Vancouver up here, so what this is showing is that the average house price or median house price in West Vancouver is, you know, maybe just over 3 million, and the median household income is 140,000, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Right, which is not what we would expect, right? So that, I mean, and so what that generates is if you have a very high house price and a relatively modest income or average or median income, right? then you're going to get these very high house price to income ratios across these municipalities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting here, and this is where the insight comes from, is that like if we think about the commonly attributed factors for high housing prices, you can think of the supply constraints and you can think of the interest rates, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, we can hold those constant, right? So we have essentially single family detached houses in Vancouver. We can't build any net new single family detached houses. We kind of used up all the land except for the agricultural reserve, but that's generally speaking understood to be out of bounds. And so we're not building any net new houses, right? So you have perfectly inelastic supply of these types of houses, and you have the same interest rates and mortgage regime across all these municipalities, right? So then the question is, why do you have such a pronounced price to income ratio and such a pronounced disconnect between prices and incomes in some municipalities relative to others, right? And we're getting to price to income ratios that simply don't seem to make sense, right? Like a bank doesn't lend, 20 times your income. That's not happening. So the point is, so who are the marginal buyers? What kind of income are they using? And the interesting thing there is we now finally have the data through the Canada Housing Statistics Program to kind of estimate at least a base rate, a conservative rate of non-resident ownership, kind of foreign ownership, people who are not necessarily resident. And that will capture in a geographic way kind of where a lot of the satellite family dynamics that we talked about earlier are, where people are kind of making money overseas and not necessarily declaring it here, but the family is here and living here and they live in expensive houses. And so if we want to understand what's driving that decoupling pattern and its stark difference across municipalities, which you won't find in coupled housing markets, in housing markets which are not highly influenced by foreign money directly, like the London, Ontario example, right? So you wouldn't have a very stark difference in house price to income. But if we want to understand that and we compare that to the share of non-resident ownership across these different municipalities, we have a very powerful relationship, right? So the areas that are most affected by non-resident ownership, by foreign money, right, have the highest price to income ratios, right? The most disconnect. And this kind of makes sense because essentially you have these people who are coming in with a lot of money, so they're buying expensive properties, but they're declaring very low incomes, right? Which pulls down your median income statistic and pulls up your median house price statistic.
So let's just kind of unpack this just to be clear. So on this axis over here on the left, we have the median home price to income ratio. So, going back to the one that we highlighted, kind of West Van, this is, an area where home prices are 20 plus times household income. So where, households
of the people who own them.
Who own them. So you're controlling for renters, you're cutting out all the renters, all that stuff.
Yeah.
So these are basically the homeowners. So the homeowners who are making 140 grand can afford $3.5 million homes, which is why they are 20 plus times income. And then on sort of this lower axis down here, you're measuring the percentage, the percent of homes that are owned by non-residents, correct?
Yes. And the
So
CMHC, sorry, it's not the CMHC. The Statistics Canada defines non-resident ownership basically as, and this is the participation rate, so where at least one of the people on title is not resident in Canada, and so they look for kind of tax residency. Are you a member of organizations in Canada, and so on. If they can't find any evidence of residency of that sort in Canada, then you're deemed non-resident. So
I see.
Yeah.
So in these sort of low, kind of down in this area, we have house prices that are just over 5 times income, but only 2% of those buyers are non-residents compared to West Van, where it's nearly 10%.
Yeah. Yeah. So essentially, house prices make a lot more sense relative to incomes in the areas where you have much less foreign money involved. Okay. And again, I will say that doesn't necessarily mean, because of the dynamics that we talked about earlier, that doesn't mean that the money in the high end doesn't affect and flow through to those other municipalities and those other housing markets.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, you're going to see the starkest patterns of this kind of decoupling or disconnect between housing prices and incomes in the areas that have the highest foreign ownership. And again, you're holding kind of supply dynamics and interest rates and mortgage regulations kind of constant, right? And so that's why you have, this very strong relationship, arguably.
So what do these differences look like when we look at the kind of the Toronto area?
Right. So in Toronto, you have the same thing, except it's a little bit less crazy, right? So, I mean, in Vancouver is a very pronounced version of this. But if you look at Toronto, so I've done the same thing as the chart above, where I'm looking at the median house price of a single detached house relative to the median owner income of working age people who own those houses, right? So again, we're controlling for renters and elderly folks.
Mm-hmm.
And again, so what we see is that there's, a decent dispersion in those ratios across the GTA or the Toronto CMA area, right? And it's particularly pronounced in Richmond Hill and Markham. And so, that as your data was showing, was kind of an area where there was a lot of speculation that was happening in 2015, 2016, 2017, mm-hmm. right? So that's kind of an indication of what's going on to some extent there. But again, we would have had some idea of this before the CHSP data. Mm-hmm. The question is, how would we account for this, right? What's driving this kind of pattern of dispersion? Mm-hmm. And so again, we can compare these different municipalities or townships, et cetera, with the statistics on the non-resident ownership share, right? And when we do that, again, we find a strong relationship. It's not as strong as in Vancouver, arguably because I would argue foreign money has played a much more prominent role in mm-hmm. Vancouver, and that's actually shows up on your non-resident ownership share. Mm-hmm. If you look at the axis on the bottom on your x-axis, those are half the figures that the Vancouver statistics were. Yeah. So it just shows that foreign ownership is less prominent in Toronto. So, but nevertheless, you can understand kind of that divergence, at least in part, through the influence of foreign money. And again, what's going on there is you have areas that have quite high housing prices, like Markham and Richmond Hill, mm-hmm. where there's relatively low incomes being declared amongst a significant portion, not everyone, but a significant enough portion of the kind of the working age population that pulls down your median income statistic. And so these kind of really high price to income ratios make a lot of sense, actually, ultimately, once you start to understand the role of foreign money.
So at the extreme end, we have Markham and Richmond Hill here, where home prices are 8 or just over 8 times household income. And according to sort of the axis on the bottom, and like from between 3.5% to 4% of the owners are non-residents. Now, this does not, I'm assuming this does not capture all like foreign investment.
Exactly, and that's the key point, right? And so when the data was released, right, yeah. the industry and a lot of people who had previously been kind of denying the role of foreign money, they go, oh, well, it's such a small proportion, it can't possibly have an effect, right? I mean, first of all, you have to differentiate between your stock and your flow, right? So what proportion of your market today is comprised of people who are non-resident buyers, right?
So that's
but the other important thing...
Yeah. So that's the stock, what you're talking about.
Exactly. So this is the stock, right? So you could have a fairly low stock, but if there's a lot of people that are in the market who are buying today,
I see,
using foreign money, then that can have a much greater impact, and your stock figure is going to, suggest that they're playing a far lesser role than they actually are. And if you look at like the condo ownership data, for example, they can look at kind of the ownership of condos that were built in 2016, 2017, the CHSP data looks at, and the non-resident ownership rate in that segment in the 2016-17 was about twice the rate of the kind of overall rate of non-resident ownership. So what that's indicating is that, like, if 3 to 4% of your stock is owned by your not by non-residents, potentially at least something like double could be in terms of your flow. So it could be 6-7% in terms of non-residents buying in the market today, or even more, right? But the other important point is that this is simply a proxy for the foreign money, and this is important, right? These are people who often don't have any connection to Canada, right? Mm-hmm. But we also know that a great deal of money arrives with people who come and move here, right? Take up residency, take up citizenship or permanent residency, etc., right? And so why this is so powerful is that this is kind of a very conservative proxy for that kind of money. And so once we understand that this is kind of just proxying that money, right, on a geographic basis, it's just saying there's much more of that money in these types of areas than there is in these other areas, not that this is the sum total of the money that's coming in. Then again, we can understand why it might have such a huge impact. So go ahead. I'll just give you an example, which I might put in a paper coming up, is I looked at UBC, the kind of UBC area in Vancouver. People in Toronto won't be necessarily familiar with it, but it's a very kind of wealthy, expensive area. And you have these houses that are worth about, $7 million. And the average, the median income of the people who own those houses is something like 120 or something like that thousand. I mean, it's just bonkers disconnect. But if you look at the non-resident ownership share there, it's only about 12%. So if you turn around though and say, well, only 12% of the UBC housing market is foreign money, I mean, anybody who knows the Vancouver housing market is going to turn around and laugh at you, because it's long been known that that's where overwhelmingly, the housing is being bought by foreign money, right? Something like 70-80%, right? And so again, these non-resident ownership share as a stock figure is going to be a significant underestimate of your true kind of flow share of the market from foreign money.
So just to unpack a couple of key points that you made, I think are important. So on the first is this idea of stock and flow, just to make sure everyone gets it. So your chart here is showing that, say, just over 4% of all homes in Richmond Hill are owned by non-residents, at least as they're tracked by StatsCan. But your point is that, I mean, to get to that point, it's more likely that more than 4% of homes that are bought today in Richmond Hill are bought by non-residents. So that's the flow that you're talking about, right? So
yes,
we're more likely to have a higher percent. And I guess to your point, that's kind of actually what's influencing the housing prices more, the fact that you have a disproportionate number of them actually potentially buying.
That's right.
So that's a really interesting and I think an important point. I guess, and your other point, of course, is that this, of course, is just capturing pure non-resident ownership. And I think obviously your paper talks about something far bigger than that, which is, as we kind of started this discussion, which is not necessarily just non-resident ownership, but this idea of, someone who earns their income not in Canada, lives here, could potentially be a resident, that may also be a proxy for some of this type of stuff. So it's, foreign capital that's coming into Canada. Exactly. That might be skewing some of these trends.
For sure.
Is that right?
Absolutely. So kind of in the paper, I define foreign ownership as housing that's primarily purchased with foreign income or wealth, which is not taxed as income in Canada, right? Mm-hmm. And so once you understand it as kind of, foreign money being used to purchase housing, which is not taxed as income in Canada, then you have a much better sense of why that's so influential. Mm-hmm. Because it can be far broader than simply non-resident buyers or foreign citizen buyers, right? And this is part of we're having a bit of a disingenuous debate, unfortunately, because a lot of people want to confuse the public about this, right? And so they talk about, foreign citizen buyers or non-resident only buyers, right? Because they don't want to talk about, how much of a role the money that's flowing in from abroad is having, right?
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as we understand it as about kind of foreign capital, as I've explained it, then the role is much clearer, and that's why these types of relationships that we've just gone through are so strong, right? Again, it's very hard to explain these types of patterns without reference to these types of things, and so that the fact that it kind of matches up once we finally have some decent data, I think again is pretty indicative of the solidity of this view.
So one thing I think that's important to, I mean, just unpack for our viewers is I think your data here makes the case for, I think something that's really interesting. I mean, I think a lot of people look at obviously the high house price to income ratios in Toronto. Obviously, a lot of people think it's really unaffordable, which it is, and irrational. But your paper kind of makes the case where, you know, for a rational explanation why it's so high, if that makes sense, right? And the idea being, well, if you look at Markham and Richmond Hill, I mean, house price to incomes are so elevated, not just because of some irrational exuberance necessarily, but because incomes are being understated, which is, I think, is an interesting point. I think it makes it hard to study and analyze the housing market and for people to make sense of, but I think it's actually an interesting point when people are trying to kind of understand how all of these these different factors that might influence house prices work together. So I think that's a really interesting kind of key takeaway.
Yeah. I mean, of course, I'd agree. But if I can just show you one further chart, which kind of illustrates what you're talking about, right? So we also have data on kind of what I call low income ownership, where basically households are declaring quite low incomes. Mm-hmm. So this is for households in the lowest income quintiles amongst homeowners. And so that in Toronto is around between 0 and 48,000 roughly in household income. And so that's a pretty low income for a household. And this is for people in working age, right? So this is not including seniors again, this is not including renters. And again, what we see is a very high rate of that type of income situation, right? In Richmond Hill and Markham, right? And a range of other places. I haven't added data labels to all the other things, and if people are interested, they could contact me.
So this is the share of homeowners that are in the lowest income bracket.
That's right.
Okay, so
out of as a share of the people who are owning single-family detached houses in that area. Okay,
that makes sense. And then on the bottom we have non-resident ownership again. So what you're showing is, okay, Markham and Richmond Hill again, a significant portion of homeowners in the lowest income bracket, which is really,
that's right.
So,
okay. And so what that's evidence of, and all I'm saying there is that likely non-resident ownership is highly correlated with the satellite family type dynamic, where people are earning abroad and not necessarily declaring incomes in Canada, mm-hmm. right? Which is an aggressive tax filing, but in certain cases can be legit, right? And so again, that's been my point, is we have a faulty tax system. And so, if you're going to live in a really nice area and consume the various social services that are paid for by, income taxes in substantial measure, right? Then, if you're pretty well off, with which a lot of the people who own these houses are, then you should contribute your fair share. And we should also thereby discourage that dynamic such that, Toronto and Vancouver sort of become subsidized resort towns for the world's rich. And so that's the idea, is just to that's one component, and an important component in my view, of the affordability situation. And we can address that through policy.
Okay, so we have about 5 or so minutes left. So maybe what we can do from here is maybe you can kind of walk us through what is the policy response to this. I mean, so Ontario, I should say, obviously introduced a non-resident speculation tax, which is basically a tax on people who are buying homes that are not, that are non-residents buying homes. But BC has done quite a few more things to kind of curb this. So maybe you can kind of walk us through maybe some of what BC has done,
Yeah.
you know, maybe how effective it's been and what else you think can be done on top of that, if anything.
Sure. So I think this chart is a good kind of background to have for this part of the discussion. My view was always that the foreign buyer tax or foreign buyer taxes, kind of whatever form or name they get given, were important and useful policy tools, but would not be sufficient. Partly because, as we've just talked about, you know, much of the action is not happening through foreign citizens. It's foreign money, and so a tax on foreign citizen buying is not going to affect that bigger category of foreign money flowing in. But nevertheless, I thought that those policy measures were important, partly because they would kind of cool down the market somewhat, right? So limit some of the demand that was happening in a very hot market. But the other thing is that they would affect speculative expectations. And so you had these kind of expectations in 2016, 2017 that like prices were always going to rise at a really strong rate. You know, there was, you know, the possibility of flipping a house after 1 or 2 years for just massive profits, and everybody wanted to kind of get in on it. And so governments needed to send a message to the market like, you know, we're willing to take pretty bold action to turn prices around, even potentially to dampen demand. And you know that further policy might be on the way that is going to dampen this demand and speculative demand. And so be careful, right? And so that's, in my view, a big part of why, you know, you see the chart as we do here, which is that they had a pretty big effect on kind of changing expectations. Arguably, they had bigger. It had a bigger impact on expectations and on the market in Toronto, in fact, than Vancouver, which is surprising because the non-resident speculation tax was a weaker version of the foreign buyers tax. There's a bunch of loopholes in effect in the non-resident speculation tax, which I was pointing out at the time, like these are not good loopholes to have, but nevertheless, it seemed to have a pretty big impact on the market. And a lot of people said, oh, wait, you know, maybe this is a bubble. Maybe I should sell now. And so you actually saw a sharp rise in new listings, which you didn't see in Vancouver. And so all of a sudden your inventory increased dramatically from April when it was introduced or announced until August. And so it had a big impact on changing the psychology of the market. But again, for a long-term impact, it's just not sufficient because it's missing kind of the core dynamic that we've talked about, which is this faulty tax structure. So what that's where the speculation and vacancy tax comes in, and we can talk about that.
So what we're looking at here then is sort of on this axis, we have the year-over-year change in house prices. So going from 0% to 35%. In black, we have Vancouver's change in house prices. So what you're showing here is this big run up between 2017 and mid 2016 where house prices were going up 30+%, right?
Yeah.
And it looks like this first dotted line is when BC introduced their foreign buyers tax.
Correct.
And then we have Toronto in red also kind of showing this rapid growth, you know, pretty much, I don't know what that is, 6 or 9 months lagged. And then they introduced their foreign buyers tax, which is this second dotted line. And then similar to BC, we see this rapid decline in the growth in house prices. And then this third line, of course, are the policies that BC introduced after the fact, right? And what were those? And why do you think, you know, maybe they're potentially more effective than just the foreign buyers tax?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the third line is when the speculation and vacancy tax was announced, but there were other policy measures that they introduced at that time. And you also did have the stress test that was introduced around then too. But in my view, you know, for the BC impact, I think it was much more about the speculation and vacancy tax. But also they increased the foreign buyer tax from 15 to 20%. And they applied it to a range of urban areas, right? And the speculation and vacancy tax, I mean, it's hard to explain in brief for those who don't know it. I mean, I've written a couple of explainers, and so people can look that up. But the big change with the speculation and vacancy tax is that, I mean, you have a tax on vacancy. So units that are left for longer than 6 months, that are second properties, you know, can be taxed at a given rate depending on the ownership situation. So you have a differential rate between kind of Canadian residents and foreign buyers and satellite families. But the big kind of change and policy move that's associated with the speculation and vacancy tax that really had an impact, in my view, was this idea that even if it's your primary residence, even if it's your principal residence, and you are a satellite family, which means they define as more than 50% of the household income comes from abroad, that you would then pay a 2% property tax annually.
Over and above the regular property tax.
Over and above, right? So that's a 2% rate, which could be quite substantial, right? So on a $4 million house, I mean, that's a lot of money. And so that would have a significant impact. And so you have a lot of these satellite family situations where, you know, you have wealthy families that are declaring quite low incomes, and they would finally have to pay a substantial amount into the treasury, into the BC Treasury. And that would discourage that kind of dynamic. That would discourage the foreign ownership. And so in the markets, what's really interesting is in the markets that were most affected by foreign money, especially the single family detached markets, there was a huge impact on prices. I mean, prices dropped, you know, you can talk to Steve Saretsky or somebody else who knows the stats like a little bit better, but, you know, they were dropping 20% or something like that while you know, interest rates were still low and unemployment rate was still low and stuff. So you had a big hit to prices in some of these areas.
But why would prices fall in response to the speculation and vacancy tax? Like, what was behind that?
Well, there would be two things that would happen, but primarily a lot of the money that would not have been coming through the foreign citizens necessarily, but coming through kind of people who were coming through the Quebec Investor Immigration Program, or wealthy individuals who are coming through the regular immigration stream or whatever, who had planned on setting up a satellite family type dynamic, you know, they would be dissuaded from buying. And so, you know, you take those buyers out of your market, and those are the people that are driving those prices at the very high end. And all of a sudden your prices are going to fall dramatically because local incomes can't support that.
So you're saying the speculation and vacancy tax actually curbed demand from new potential buyers who are planning on doing the same thing, like having a satellite family earning their income abroad. Yeah. It actually cooled demand from those purchasers.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at sales in those high-end areas, they were very, very low for a while. Mm-hmm. You know, they started to bounce back, and then I'm not sure exactly what's going on right now with, I mean, COVID is obviously going to screw up our data in a lot of respects. But you know, essentially what it meant was that, you know, the prices fell a fair bit, and then some of the interest started to be kind of rekindled a bit, but that's because, in a sense, people are now factoring in the potential to have to pay a speculation and vacancy tax on a kind of continuous basis on that property. Mm-hmm. So you know, that's part of what's going on there. But the interesting thing is that this had the greatest impact at the high end, but it also trickled down into the condo market, and so condo prices have fallen. Again, where they're at right now, they kind of were starting to bounce back earlier this year. But again, they were, compared to the dramatic rises that we were seeing before, mm-hmm. you know, they've moderated considerably. And so kind of compared to the out of control real estate market that we had before, the market has changed dramatically. And from the perspective of a kind of first-time home buyer or somebody who wants to buy into the market, it's a lot better market now. The final thing I'll say about that, and then you can ask a question, but is just that the impact has also been slightly mitigated by the fact that there are still some exemptions and kind of weaknesses, in my view, to the tax.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, if you own a single detached property and you rent out a portion of that, so you're a satellite family, you own a big mansion and you own rent out a portion of that, say a basement suite or something, then you can be exempt from the speculation tax, from the 2% tax on an annual basis.
Just by renting out a basement apartment.
Yes. So
Wow.
that, in my view, was not a good exemption to make. And so it's those types of kind of workarounds that are being discovered. And I think, for the next, potential policy reform on this front, you would want to start to tighten that. And then again, I think you would have more policy, price movement downwards. But so, people started to realize that there would be potential ways around it, which they at first maybe didn't see that. Mm-hmm. But again, this is going to put incomes in a lot greater focus relative to house prices in BC. And so kind of these big discrepancies in declared incomes relative to like very high house prices, the government's now going to have a much better sense of that. And so mm-hmm. tax avoidance is going to be a lot harder. And so, this is a great policy framework to introduce. And it's had a pretty substantive and significant effect. And so, if Toronto wanted to have, movement in this direction, of course, COVID complicates that, and governments are understandably wary about introducing bold new policy right now. And mm-hmm. I get that. But, had they wanted to, or should they want to in the future, that's a pretty good policy tool that they can kind of copy and paste in a way with some tweaks from the Vancouver model.
Awesome. Josh, thank you so much for this. Super interesting, super helpful. I got a lot out of it. I'm sure our listeners did. We're going to wrap up with just two final questions. We're asking all of our speakers. The theme for our conference this year is Smart Caution. What does Smart Caution mean to you?
Smart Caution, wow. I would be very, and I am very leery about getting into the market right now.
Okay.
That chart that was shown earlier with the IMF, where prices still don't seem to be aligned with fundamentals. So I would be very cautious, especially, Canada is doing reasonably well on COVID. The United States not so well at the moment. So it's going to be pretty interesting how that all shakes out. We also have big geopolitical dynamics going on right now. Mm-hmm. So I would be very cautious about taking on more than you can afford for a place that you don't plan on being in for a long time.
That makes sense.
That's
Great
probably
advice.
a theme that you've been hammering home, but that I suppose would be what I would urge.
100%. And that's great advice. Our last question, of course, is would you buy or sell a home right now?
I would, if I had a home, I would sell it.
Really? Okay. So
but again, as you've pointed out many times, it depends what your house situation is. If you love your house and you're going to live there for a long time and that's what it's for.
Yeah.
If it's an investment oriented decision, then you do something different. What was remarkable is when the Vancouver market took off, lots of people had the chance to sell at an extremely high price.
Yeah.
But, they love their neighborhood. They, it's not about the money for them. They love where they live, and, they've already made a lot, so that they're not too worried about the financial aspect.
Yeah.
And so they just want to continue living their lives in their communities. And for a lot of people, that makes sense. And so from that standpoint, it's not necessarily sell, but awesome. If it was a investment oriented decision, then maybe.
Josh, thanks so much. Thanks again for sharing your research with us today. Super helpful, again, super interesting for myself. I'm sure our viewers got a lot out of it. So thank you again for taking the time.
Thanks, John. Good to chat.